harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and scourge you in their synagogues. You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, do not worry about how or what you should speak, for it will be given to you in that hour what you should speak. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Now brother will deliver up brother to death, father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. I just wanted to touch on those two particular scriptures before we go to the book of Acts. Because I listen to lots of people over the years when they're giving their testimonies, or what they call their testimonies. And a lot of what I hear within their testimonies is about them and about their past. And they end up speaking for an hour with 50 minutes of the 60 minutes based on themselves, with just a short conclusion about Jesus and what Jesus has done in their life. You know, the thing is, I don't want to really recount my past and everything I did in my past. Do I use my past at times to illustrate something? Yes. Is my past there to give me remembrance of what has actually transpired in my life when I came to faith? Yes. But the real testimony is not in my past, but it's in my present condition that I find myself now. And that is what I should be giving testimony to. That's what the scriptures are talking about. You know, so many times, and look, it's out of the best of intentions, but some people give you a breakdown of their whole life before they get to Jesus. And all I hear about is how bad they were, or how ruthless they were, or how violent they were, or how they were addicts and what they did. They did this, they did that. And you know, like I said, they'll get to the end and they just tab Jesus on at the end. So I'm going to give you an illustration scripturally of a testimony and what true testimony is. And I'm centering it around the Apostle Paul. But the Apostle Paul gives us a very clear illustration of what our testimony should look like and what the emphasis of our testimony is about. And I just want to set the scene. Paul was a man that went through a lot. When he was converted to Christ, he would become an apostle that would face persecution, would go through intense suffering for the gospel. Paul was a man who utilised his own testimony to bring glorification to Christ. He wanted people to see Christ. He wanted people to see Christ in Paul. He wanted to see the difference Christ had made to his life. And Paul goes through a lot. And Luke, who would travel with Paul, historically keeps an account of the apostles' journeys. I love reading about Paul. Paul was a man who loved his own kinsmen. He loved the Jews. But he also was called of God to go to the Gentiles and to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. And the first thing Paul would do when he went into a city was to go to the synagogues first. And because of Paul's testimony concerning Christ, Paul couldn't help but speak about Christ in the synagogues. So he goes to Jerusalem. I'm just setting the scene. And he goes into the temple and he starts to preach Christ to the Jews. So what do the Jews do? They arrest him. His own kinsmen. They arrest him. And you pick up the whole story here, leading to 26. You pick it up in chapter 21. So I would encourage you later to read from 21 all the way through to 26 to get it all in its context. But, I love Paul because nothing was going to stop him or hinder him from preaching the truth concerning Messiah. That Messiah had come and that his kinsmen had missed it. And Paul now wanted them to see what they had missed in the life of Christ, his death and resurrection. So they arrest him and they accuse him of defiling the holy place. Do you know what the charge was they brought against him? They said he defiled the temple. This is the way they would think in these days, because they said he brought a Greek into the temple. So therefore he defiled it. That was the charge. And the Sanhedrin, they were seeking to kill Paul. The same Sanhedrin that sought the death of Christ. What you've got to understand is, Paul was once, I believe, a member of the Sanhedrin. He was a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He knew the Old Testament. He knew it inside and out. He dedicated his life to the law of God by becoming a Pharisee and by learning at the feet of one that they said was the greatest of the rabbis, Gamaliel. And so Paul was highly educated in Judaic law. And they wanted to kill him. His own kinsman wanted him put to death. But what happens is the Romans come down because of all of what's happening, and Paul goes into their custody. The reason why is because the Jews have brought about a great conspiracy theory surrounding Paul, that not only is he defiling the temple and therefore breaching the laws of God, but he has also defamed the name of Caesar. So he's taken into custody. So, do you see the similes happening in Paul's life that happened in Jesus' life? It's quite incredible what's happening here. The same conspiracies were brought against Christ. That, Christ was blasphemous when it came to the Judaic customs and laws, and that he had defiled the temple. And also that he refused to come into submission to Caesar. So we see all the similes happening here. So the Roman garrison comes and they take Paul into custody. What I love about Paul is, even though he's getting taken away by the Romans, he then says to them, before you take me and put me inside, can I just stand here at the doorway and address the crowd? This is the mob that was going to kill him. He now wants to address them. So he stands up and he speaks to them and he says, I'll just read a little bit of it to you. He says, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people. This is what he said to the leader of the garrison, to the captain. So Paul would then speak in Hebrew. And because he started to speak in Hebrew, the mob went quiet and listened to him. And you know what he does? He gives his testimony. I'm not going to share it with you right now. I'm going to share it with you when we get to 26. Paul loved his kinsmen. And he wanted to see them come to salvation. He wanted them to receive the truth concerning Jesus of Nazareth, the Jesus they had crucified, put to death. The thing is, once he's taken into custody, even then, his own kinsmen are conspiring of a way to kill him. So the reality is, they're going to wait for him to be taken to the governor, to be judged. And on their way, they're going to set an ambush and kill him. And Paul gets wind of this, and then he sends a person to let them know what's going to happen. So they take him by night to where? Capernaum. They take him to Capernaum. When he gets to Capernaum, his case is going to be heard by a governor by the name of Felix. Felix was the Roman governor, or praetor as they called him back then. And Felix was a ruthless man. He didn't show much mercy to anyone. What's intriguing about Felix is that Felix, being the governor, has a wife who is a Jew. Her name's Drusilla. Interesting, isn't it? And Paul has to come before him and set his defense. Those from Jerusalem that brought the accusations against Paul, they would have to travel to Jerusalem to give testimony against Paul. And Paul would have to set his defense. You know, Paul is not only a godly man, but he's a very wise man. He obviously was a very prayerful man. And he understood that he needed to seek God's wisdom when it came to presenting his defense before Felix. So within that judgment, Paul, before Felix, gives his testimony again concerning his faith. And Paul really starts to judge Felix. He starts to bring, the testimony before him to be more about the downside of Felix and how Felix needs to come to a place of righteousness and needs to have areas in his life of self-control. Paul starts to bring all this out to Felix. And Felix, after he hears the accusations, after he hears Paul's defense that Paul is a righteous man, that Paul does not contradict the importance of worshipping God, that Paul is a kinsman to the Jews, that he has, compassion for his fellow Jews. He wants salvation for the Jews. He wants to teach the Jews about the righteousness of God. He wants to teach his kinsmen about the fruits of receiving the Spirit of God and what that brings in their life and causes. And when Felix hears all this, all he can say is, go away. Go away for now. When I have a more convenient time, I'll call for you, Paul. But for now, go away. So he does go away for 2 years. He's imprisoned in Capernaum. But after 2 years, Felix would be succeeded by Porcius Festus. Porcius Festus would come to govern throughout the area of Jerusalem, through to Capernaum. It was quite a large area, and other surrounding areas. Felix was taken away back to Rome. Nero called for Felix to come back to Rome because Felix had to answer some charges that had come against Felix, so he had to go back and answer to Nero. So Porcius Festus is raised up as the governor. And the Porcius Festus, he goes into Jerusalem because he's told about this man, Paul, that's been imprisoned for 2 years. Festus was more of a compassionate ruler than what Felix was. So Porcius Festus, he goes to Jerusalem to find out what is the go with this Paul that's been imprisoned in Capernaum for 2 years. So he goes to seek the information that he needs from the Sanhedrin. So he goes to Jerusalem. And of course, they're appealing to Festus to have Paul brought back to Jerusalem for a hearing. But again, they're conspiring a way to kill Paul. So they were conspiring that as he would go back to Jerusalem, again, he would be ambushed and killed. So Festus goes to Capernaum. And he brings forth Paul. The Jews, once again, had to travel to Capernaum to bring the accusations before Festus, and Festus would sit in judgment of Paul, and he would ask Paul, was it okay to have it heard back in Jerusalem? But here's how wise Paul is. You can read it in chapters 24, 25 concerning Felix and Festus for yourself. One thing that Paul has in his favour is he can ask for it to be heard before Caesar. You see, Paul, when he was Saul, was born in Tarsus. So therefore, in Tarsus, when you were born in that city, because it was under Roman rule, you automatically became a Roman citizen. And Paul would use that to his advantage. So when he goes before Festus, and after the accusations have been brought, and he sets his defence, he then also appeals to Festus not to send him back to Jerusalem, because he wants to be heard before Caesar. Also, what's happening in the life of Paul is prophecies being fulfilled, because God spoke to Paul right back in Jerusalem and said to Paul that he is set to go to Rome. You see, so God puts everything in place. And Paul would eventually go to Rome. And of course, we know the story. He gets shipwrecked on the way and things happen. But he ends up in Rome. But Festus, he doesn't really know what to do with Paul. He doesn't really understand why there's such a fuss by the Sanhedrin concerning Paul. He doesn't understand Judaic law a lot. Festus has only come in and only has been there for a short time. So he doesn't have a great knowledge concerning the Jews and all the Jewish laws and the accusations that are being brought against Paul. So, you can call it by coincidence or by chance, but we spoke about that last week. Nothing happens by chance. God sets things in play. So here we have in chapter 26 where King Agrippa comes into the scene. He actually comes into the scene in 25, but the main part I want to expound on is in 26 when it comes to our testimony. Now, King Agrippa II is an interesting character in history, as all the Herods are. His great-grandfather, who can forget his great-grandfather? Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the one that ordered all the male children under 2 years of age to be executed. Then we have his father, Agrippa I, just to appease the people. Because you've got to remember, the Jews hated, had a contempt for anyone that was in this sect, as they called it, the Way. They hated them with a passion and wanted them either imprisoned or put to death. So Agrippa I, just to appease the people, put James, the brother of John, to death. He would be the first of Jesus' disciples to be put to death. And that was by Agrippa I. So here we have Agrippa II and his so-called sister, Bernice, come into the picture. Bernice was married originally to Agrippa II's uncle. There was a lot of controversy when he died and Bernice went back to Agrippa II's house and lived with him. Most historians would say they were in an incestuous relationship, which wouldn't surprise me because of the history of the Herods. So let's take it up. Because what we're going to see here is Paul's testimony. And do you know something? His testimony doesn't change. Whether it's in Acts 9, whether it's in the earlier chapters that I just spoke of from 21 onwards, his testimony never changes, you know. Never changes. So let's read it. Then Agrippa said to Paul, I'm taking it up where he's before Agrippa. The reason why Agrippa's now listening to the case is because Festus has asked Agrippa because of Agrippa's knowledge of Judaic laws and customs. So then Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. You got to understand that they had to give permission for Paul to speak in their presence, whether it was Festus, whether it was Agrippa, anyone that held the high esteemed position. So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. Listen to what he says. He's just had 2 years in prison. He says, I think myself happy. Do you know what the word happy means? Blessed. Blessed. Paul sees himself as blessed, happy. I couldn't imagine myself in Long Bay going, oh boy, I'm really blessed here. Could you? But Paul, he counted everything a blessing. You know, you could imagine Paul in that 2 years. I wonder how many Roman guards were converted in Capernaum. He can't help himself, Paul. He just has to share his faith. Jew or Gentile. He just wanted to see people come to the saving knowledge that he had received. Because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, especially because you are an expert, this is Agrippa he's talking to, you are an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, says Paul, I beg you to hear me patiently. My manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem, all the Jews know. In other words, they know me. They know who I am. I am Saul of Tarsus. I am a Pharisee. I am one of those that was of the Sanhedrin. You all know me. He says, my manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem, all the Jews know. They knew me from the first, if they were willing to testify that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. You see, the Pharisees were stricter than the Sadducees. The Sadducees were more political. They were more of the left, if you want to call them that. The Pharisees were very set when it came to God's laws and God's customs. They dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's when it came to the laws. And Paul was a Pharisee. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. Do you see what he's appealing to Agrippa about? He's gone straight for the jugular. He's saying, you know the prophecies concerning Messiah. He says, and you know God's promise to our fathers that Messiah will come. To this promise, our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. So Paul's saying, this is what I have on offer. I'm offering eternal life because Messiah has come. Salvation has come. For this hope's sake, King Agrippa, says Paul, I am accused by the Jews. Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead? You see, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection, didn't they? Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. Sadducees didn't believe in angels. Pharisees did. And Paul's appealing to Agrippa, I'm not teaching anything that's not a truth. Do you see the wisdom of Paul in his testimony? And he says to Agrippa, indeed, I myself thought I must do many things contrary to the name of Jesus at Nazareth. This I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests. You see, all the chief priests are there, bringing accusation, aren't they? Along with the Sanhedrin. They're all there. And he says to them, I actually worked on behalf of these guys that are bringing an accusation against me. And when they were put to death, he says, I cast my vote against them. In other words, he gave approval. And I punished them often in every synagogue and compelled them to blaspheme. And being exceedingly enraged against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. In other words, he had such a hatred, let's call them Christians, for the Christians, for those that had become followers of Christ, for those that were preaching the death and resurrection of Christ. Paul had a hatred. So much so that he wanted to see them dead. And he had become basically a hunter of those of the way. While thus, Paul goes on, he says, occupied, as I journeyed to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priests at midday, O king, along the road I saw a light from heaven. He mentions it's midday. Because that's when what? The sun is shining at its brightest. So this light he beholds far, far supersedes the light of the sun. I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those who journeyed with me. They beheld the light. And when we all had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, Saul, remember he's still Saul at this point. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? No wonder he was converted. A light brighter than the sun strikes him down and all that those that are serving him and travelling with him. They all fall to the ground. He then hears the voice of God. They don't, he does. He says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. If you don't know what a goad is, it's a strap of timber at the back of where the horses or oxen or any of those travel pulling a cart, and they kick back and they'll hit that. It keeps them on a straight and narrow way. He says, it's no good to kick against the goads, so I said, who are you, Lord? He knows this is supernatural. And he said, I am Jesus. Can you imagine Paul? I am Jesus. Now, we don't know if Paul was at the crucifixion of Jesus, but he would have heard about it, absolutely. And he knows that Jesus was put to death. He knows that they put him in a tomb, but he also probably has heard what he would have imagined were just fables or myths concerning his resurrection. But here, he's come face to face with the Shekinah of God, and the voice that speaks to him out of the light is the light, Jesus. I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, but rise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you. Do you see his testimony? How much time did Paul spend on the things he did that were rotten and bad? Did he go through every single person he killed? Or how many times he persecuted someone? No. He just spoke briefly, only to confirm that he was once like they are. Is that not how we should use our testimony? To say, we were once like you are, but this is what Christ has done in my life. When I met him on my road to Damascus and the light come on and he said, I am Jesus. I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles, to whom now send you, to open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me, the words of Jesus. You see, with Paul, the testimony, our testimony, should be all about Christ. Our testimony is his testimony. Our testimony is that our eyes were open to the truth of the gospel. That's our testimony. Our testimony is the gospel of Jesus Christ and what that does in our life. That's the testimony. Did Paul use examples out of his past briefly? Yes. But he didn't make it all about his past. He made it all about his conversion. And that Christ had called him to be a minister to the Jews, to the Gentiles. You know, Paul's appearing before governors and kings. What were those scriptures I read to you at the start of this sermon? That he will go before governors and kings. Jesus said we will all go before governors and kings. We will even speak to those that have authority over us the truth concerning our faith. We will not be silenced by anybody when it comes to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So Paul then goes on and says, therefore, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus and in Jerusalem and throughout all the region of Judea, and then to the Gentiles, that they should what? Repent, turn to God, and do works befitting of repentance. You see, he had been taken from being a murderous, hateful, sinful, deplorable Pharisee. He had been taken and been made a minister of the gospel of peace. He had been taken from being a Pharisee of destruction to an apostle of grace, to an apostle of mercy, to an apostle of true justice, to an apostle filled with faith, with hope. He was taken from being one unrighteous to being one righteous. And why was that? Because of his Lord. The truth had set him free from the bondage of sin. For these reasons, the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. Therefore, having obtained help from God, to this day I stand witnessing both to small and great, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come. You see the appellation that he's having to Agrippa, don't you? You see, the testimony is not about Paul. The testimony is about Christ. That's his testimony. What Christ has done. What a man can receive through Christ. He had been set free from the law of God. He had been set free from that. Because he came to understand that Jesus fulfilled the law for him. And in fulfilling the law had set him free from the law. For the law would only lead to death. Because no man can keep the law, but will always fall short. He had come to understand Christ. He came to that revelation of why Christ had to die. Why he rose again. He came to understand that. He was willing to die for the cause. He was set for the defense of the gospel. Who is the gospel? Jesus Christ is the gospel. Jesus Christ is our testimony. He said, therefore, having obtained help from God, to this day I stand, witnessing both to the small and the great, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come, that the Christ would suffer, that he would be the first to rise from the dead, and would proclaim light to the Jewish people and the Gentiles. Wow. Do you know what? I don't need to bore you with an hour story concerning all the sins I've committed in my life. All you need to know is that once I was like you when you were sinners in this world. I don't need to tell everyone out there, yeah, I know, brother, what it's like to take drugs. Yeah, man, I know what it's like. I was a tough, violent man. Everybody feared me when I walked into a pub. They all put their head down because, hey, I'm a scary man. And what happens is we start to actually exalt our past. And we start to exalt ourselves. We start to even exaggerate and start to even elevate ourselves through exaggeration of our past. We start to glorify in the past when we should be glorifying in the present. I don't know what the testimonies will be like after morning tea. I really don't know. I haven't seen them. But I hope they're testimonies about Christ and what Christ has done in their lives. Now, as he thus made his defence, listen to what Festus says. Porcius Festus. He said with a loud voice, because what you've got to remember is, where they're sitting on the judgment seat, there's all those of the Sanhedrin, Jews that have come up there. There are people gathered to listen. Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad. You see, because the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. Are we not told that? But he said, this is Paul, I am not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason. For the king, before whom I also speak freely, knows these things. You see, everybody knows the truth, but they choose to suppress the truth because they enjoy sin and being sinful and fulfilling the needs of the body. For I am convinced that none of these things escapes his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, he goes, Paul, this is gutsy. He goes, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Wow. How wise was that statement? I know, this is what Paul says, I know you do believe. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. In other words, you've brought a good case. You've brought a good case. There's something here that needs consideration. He hasn't converted him, but he has certainly made him think. And Paul said, I would to God that not only you, talking to Agrippa, but also all who hear me today might become both almost and altogether such as I am, except for these chains. Then Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. You see, Paul brought such a great defense. He had challenged the intellect of King Agrippa. Agrippa saw he had a good case, and he saw that he had not breached any of the accusations that had been brought against him by the Jews. Interesting, isn't it? And he said he would have been set free except that he's appealed to Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, once they make appellation to be heard by Caesar, that has to be fulfilled. Festus has no other alternative but to send Paul on to Rome. But that's where God wanted Paul to go. But what I want us to understand today, if we are to give, or someone says, could we hear your testimony? I wonder how you would give your testimony. Would it be all about you and how sinful you are and were? Or will it be about what Christ has done? I pray that we take this testimony of Paul as an illustration, and that we give due consideration when we are called upon for our testimony. That's my prayer. It should be all about Christ. He's the only one that can set others free. So therefore, they need to hear about him. Amen.